Buddhist nonviolence is often associated with passivity, but the early Buddhist texts tell a different story. The Buddha taught non-harming as a core ethical value, but he also took decisive action in difficult situations. In today's video, we'll explore how the Buddha responded to danger, to harm and conflict without resorting to violence, and how we might learn from the Buddha's example today. First, nonviolence is a core ethical value in Buddhism. Nonviolence, that is the idea of ahimsa as it's known in Pali, is a core part of the Noble Eightfold Path. It's explicitly part of right intention, that is, that we have an intention towards ahimsa, towards nonviolence, and then it propagates out into right action, right speech, right livelihood, and into the 5 precepts, which again are a core part of Buddhist ethical values. But we may well wonder, what if violence is being done to us? Well, perhaps the most salient example in the early Buddhist texts, the most famous one, is in the simile of the saw, where the Buddha says that even if we are being sawn limb from limb by evil bandits, basically, we should not hold hatred in our hearts. Now, in saying this, the Buddha is not saying that we shouldn't do anything or we shouldn't care, but what he's saying is that we should preserve our mental stability. The Buddha's own life demonstrates that he was not recommending passivity. However, he was recommending that we preserve our own inner integrity rather than resorting to vengeful retaliation. Second, I want to turn to one key example of Buddhist nonviolence in practice, which involves the story of Angulimala. Angulimala was a notorious murderer and bandit at the time of the Buddha. His name, Angulimala, literally means garland of fingers. So it's said or understood that he wore a garland of the fingers of the people that he had murdered over the years. And so it's said that the Buddha knew where he was and wandered up into his territory. As he got closer, various townspeople tried to dissuade the Buddha from going any farther because they knew that he was in serious mortal danger. However, the Buddha persisted. And as he got closer, Angulimala saw the Buddha, this is what the texts say, got on his shield and took his sword and chased after the Buddha. However, it's said that he was unable to catch the Buddha. And eventually, impressed by the Buddha's extreme bravery and confidence, the Angulimala decided to stop pursuing him, and indeed eventually became a monastic, and after a time even became enlightened. And in part of this story, I did actually a video on this, I'll leave a link to that video down below in the notes if you want to hear more about Angulimala's story. But after Angulimala became a monastic, King Pasenadi, who was the king in the area that Angulimala was doing his horrible things, King Pasenadi came and saw Angulimala as a member of the Sangha and had this to say: "How the Buddha tames those who are wild, pacifies those who are violent, and extinguishes those who are unquenched. For I was not able to tame him with the rod and the sword, but the Buddha tamed him without rod or sword." And in a footnote to this passage, the translator Bhikkhu Sujato says, "This heads off a potential criticism of Buddhism that it would allow criminals to flourish. Nonviolent approaches are not just morally superior, but more effective." In this story, nonviolence is portrayed as courageous, as confrontational, and as transformative, not as simply passive avoidance. Third, there are many examples in the suttas of the Buddha reacting with strategic nonviolence to difficulties in the Sangha. The Buddha faced real-world difficulties many times in the suttas and the Vinaya, or the monastic rule book. He had to face threats of splitting the Sangha or undermining the rules by various wayward monastics of one kind or another. Rather than suppressing these kinds of conflicts violently, he responded with strategic nonviolence in ways to defuse these situations and move beyond them. In particular, by setting up clear boundaries. So, for example, we have one sutta that talked, or actually a couple of suttas that talk about a monastic who was part of the Sangha even though he had violated monastic rules in a very extreme way. And it's said that the Buddha simply refused to recite the monastic rules, the patimokkha, with the monastics together while this monk was in attendance. Monks who were disruptive in this way were simply expelled from the Sangha. If these monastics lived at a distance from the Buddha, then he, as in one example, had his respected monastic elders, Sariputta and Moggallana, together with a retinue of other monks to sort of forestall trouble, to go out to this distant monastic enclave and tell these two monastics to leave, basically. This is in the case of the monks of Kitagiri. Or, if all else failed, the Buddha would rely on public pressure by the laity in order to make things better. Here we have the example of the monks of Kosambi. It's said that there was a severe schism in the Sangha at Kosambi between two groups of monastics, and the Buddha went several times to try to defuse this split, to try to bring the monks back into harmony. But he was consistently rejected by one or another or both sides. And so the Vinaya goes on to say, soon the lay followers in Kosambi considered, these venerable monks at Kosambi have caused us much misfortune. The Buddha himself left because he was troubled by them. Well then, let's not bow down, rise up, raise our joined palms, or do acts of respect toward them. And let's not honor, respect, esteem, or associate with them, nor give them alms food. Then they'll either leave, disrobe, or reconcile with the Buddha. And they did just that. Soon the monks at Kosambi said, well then, let's go to Savatthi and resolve this legal issue in the presence of the Buddha. The implication in this case is that under extreme circumstances, nonviolent public pressure by the laity, by the public, by people, can make the key difference. Fourth, what kind of lessons can we take from the Buddha's actions today? Well, nonviolence does not mean rolling over. It means responding wisely rather than out of a kind of vengeful anger. The Buddha's response to harm and difficulty, as we've seen, was based in mental strength and ethical restraint. His emphasis was always on protecting the mind rather than the body, which is a pretty radical idea by modern standards, but one that we can learn from, and one that makes sense in the context that the Buddha was really trying to get us to mental purification and eventual liberation. With this in mind, we can aim for three things. First, we can set firm boundaries without thereby falling into hatred. We can speak out without being nasty. And we can take courageous moral stands without resorting to violence. Now, none of this is easy by any means. It's perfectly natural and human to respond to violence with violence. It requires patience, discernment, calm, and inner clarity to respond instead with wisdom. This is not about being nice. It's about responding directly in an ethical way to difficulties and harm. Fifth, in conclusion, the Buddha's example shows us that nonviolence is not the same as passivity nor as inaction. It's a deep training in compassion, courage, and clarity under pressure. And in our current conflict-ridden world, these ancient teachings, I think, have never been more relevant. So my question to you is, what experience do you have in responding in a nonviolent way to difficulties in your own life? And do you think that it is indeed true that nonviolence is always the best response? Or are there some borderline cases where violence will be necessary? These are all things I think we have to consider mindfully. Now, I did a separate video a while back about whether we can be too equanimous. And the hint here is that the Buddha believes we can in certain circumstances. I'll leave a link to that video up here on the screen if you haven't seen it. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked up here on the screen and down below in the notes, and see if you want to help support the channel and the work that I'm doing here. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video, and meanwhile, all of you, be well.